Hello. Thanks for joining me. Today I will be talking about collaborating with tribes and integrating indigenous ecological knowledge into kelp forest and eelgrass meadow conservation. I did my internship with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources to assist in creating a kelp and eelgrass conservation plan to be implemented in Washington, and the draft plan will be submitted to the state legislature in December of this year for approval, and I decided to explore this dimension because I found it interesting and important. To give a little background on kelp and eelgrass, they are marine species that prefer cool waters and are at risk due to rising sea temperatures. They are essential habitats for several marine species. Many of these species are central to tribal subsistence fishing and harvesting practices. This means that a decline in kelp and eelgrass will negatively impact tribal subsistence practices. Tribal participation in conservation of these marine habitats actually falls under treaty fishing rights. Phase 2 of the Bolt decision says that tribes have the right to participate in protection of the habitats for fish and shellfish as an extension of their fishing rights. The Department of Natural Resources seeks to collaborate with these tribes on planning and managing kelp and eelgrass conservation, and their goal is to create 10,000 acres of conservation sites in the Puget Sound and on the Washington coast by 2040. Now that I've given some background on the objective of my research, I will move on to my research question, which is what key strategies can be used for effective collaboration with tribes on planning and management of kelp and eelgrass conservation. To explore this, my internship mostly consisted of literature reviews. I researched literature on co-management methods and the use of indigenous ecological knowledge in conservation. I also conducted 2 case studies on 2 marine conservation areas in Hawaii and Nunavut, Canada, where I reviewed the management plans and annual reports indicating which strategies were being used and which were the most effective. From this research, I identified several potential strategies to be used for collaborating with tribes on conservation by the DNR. I compiled my findings and produced a report, which included some recommendations for the DNR to use in the kelp and eelgrass conservation plan, as well as future conservation efforts. I also reviewed the current tribal engagement plan for the development of the draft kelp and eelgrass plan, which I have summarized in figure 3 to go over it a little bit. In December of last year, a working group for the creation of the plan was put together and a tribal representative was recruited. There will be one-on-one meetings between the DNR staff and other tribal representatives between now and June of 2023. In March, several workshops were conducted to collect information from the public on their priorities and concerns about the conservation plan, 3 of which were dedicated specifically to tribal priorities and concerns. After the draft plan is finished, it will be reviewed by participating tribes in July before being made available for the general public to review. With potential feedback from tribes and the public, the draft plan will be finalized and submitted to the state legislature in December of 2023 for review and approval before conservation efforts begin. Now I will talk about the results of my research. I had identified several strategies, but I will talk about the 4 key components that I found were the most widely used and effective. In figure 5, I've created a pyramid diagram to show the importance of each component. The base of the pyramid is equal representation. I found that it is vital to have an equal number of representatives from both tribal and federal state governments. This would ensure that both tribal and state interests were being considered and implemented. The next component is the establishment of a cultural working group. This group would be consulted with on both cultural and ecological concerns and would be included in management and decision making. It's common that cultural working groups are only consulted with on cultural affairs. However, we must acknowledge that cultural or indigenous ecological knowledge is of equal importance as Western scientific ecology. This way, cultural needs are met and both types of knowledge are effectively exchanged. The next important component is educational outreach. This encourages tribal involvement and is an opportunity to pass down knowledge and preserving it by educating the youth. Today's youth are tomorrow's conservationists, so it is important to educate them holistically to ensure that this type of collaboration continues in the future. The final component that I will mention is funding for both funding for both ecological and cultural research. As I had mentioned before, cultural and indigenous ecological knowledge is of equal importance as Western scientific ecology, and there should be funding provided for both. This is also shown to encourage tribal involvement, perpetuate tribal cultural activities, and preserve knowledge. So now, finally, I will discuss the significance of collaborating with tribes and integrating indigenous ecological knowledge. As I mentioned before, it would provide opportunities for cultural research. It would provide an opportunity for preserving and perpetuating indigenous cultural and subsistence practices. I should also mention that I had recommended that selection of sites should be considered, should consider locations that are near tribal communities. This is because tribes may have a more intimate knowledge of local ecosystems, and this would be beneficial to conservation. Of course, this has some drawbacks. We must be careful to ensure that local subsistence practices are not interrupted by conservation in these areas. These tribal communities may also have inherited observational and experiential knowledge that would also be beneficial to conservation. And one more benefit that I will mention is that collaborating on conservation can strengthen government-to-government relationships between tribal and state governments. Participating in working groups and working together on conservation can encourage stronger interpersonal connections, which is the first step towards a better relationship between the two governments. In figure 4, I have listed some beneficial sources of indigenous ecological knowledge, which also includes traditional stories and indigenous ways of knowing and subsistence and management practices. And that is all that I have to share with you today. Thank you for watching my presentation.